Romance shows up almost everywhere in modern serialized storytelling. You see it in anime, in manga, in light novels and web novels, and even in gacha games. Even when romance isn't supposed to be the main focus of the story, it almost always finds its way into the narrative somehow. And that makes sense. A good romantic subplot can add a lot to a story. It can deepen characters, raise the emotional stakes, and make the world feel more personal. But if you've spent enough time reading or watching these kind of stories, you've probably noticed something. A lot of the time, the romance just isn't very good. Not always, there are definitely exceptions. But very often, the relationships feel underdeveloped, forced, or strangely disconnected from the rest of the story. Sometimes the romance barely progresses, sometimes it feels like it exists only because the genre expects it. And in certain cases, especially in some web novels or gacha games, it doesn't even feel like romance at all. It feels more like a reward system built around the protagonist. So today I want to talk about why romance so often struggles in these kind of stories, and what actually makes a romantic subplot work when it's written well. Because romance itself isn't the problem, the real issue is how it's used. If you've spent enough time reading web novels, watching anime, or playing gacha games, you start to notice something. A lot of these romantic subplots follow the exact same patterns, not just similar ideas, the exact same patterns. And once you start noticing them, they become oh so incredibly obnoxious. One of the most obvious examples is what I like to call the brick wall protagonist. You see it constantly in anime and manga. It's the kind of protagonist who can have a character openly confess their feelings and somehow still not understand what's happening. A character could practically throw themselves at them, confess directly, and make it painfully obvious that they're in love, and the protagonist will still respond with complete confusion. They either misinterpret the situation, ignore it entirely, or act like they're completely incapable of recognizing basic human attraction. At some point, it stops feeling believable and starts feeling like the story is intentionally avoiding progress. The romance can move forward, so the protagonist simply becomes oblivious to everything. Another pattern shows up in the way romantic drama is written. A lot of these stories rely on the exact same kinds of conflicts over and over again: love triangles, unnecessary rival love interests, multiple romantic candidates where it's painfully obvious who the real partner will be from the beginning. When that happens, the extra characters stop feeling like meaningful relationships and start feeling like padding. The audience already knows how the story will end, so the drama exists mostly to delay the inevitable conclusion. And sometimes that kind of drama isn't even necessary in the first place, especially in stories where romance is only supposed to be a subplot. But perhaps one of the most common problems is much simpler than that. Sometimes the romance exists for no reason at all, it's just because the genre expects it. This shows up a lot in certain web novels, especially in long-running Korean or Chinese series. The story introduces a romantic partner for the protagonist, but the relationship barely develops. The characters spend most of the narrative apart. The story rarely explores their relationship in any meaningful way, and eventually the romance starts to feel less like a relationship and more like a checkbox for the story to fill. Then there's another trend that has become much more visible in recent years: the rise of smut-driven romance. Now, I'm not talking about stories that are openly written as adult romance. That's a completely different category. The problem appears when otherwise interesting stories suddenly start following the same repetitive smut patterns. Sometimes you'll find a story with a genuinely interesting premise, interesting characters, or a compelling world, and then suddenly the narrative starts following the exact same formula you see in countless smut-driven stories. The romantic dynamics become exaggerated, the interactions become unnatural, and the character starts behaving less like people and more like archetypes designed to fulfill a specific fantasy. And when that happens, it can completely derail what might have been an otherwise engaging story. Finally, there's one more category that deserves its own discussion, because romance in gacha games works very differently from everything we've talked about so far. In fact, in many cases, it's not really written as a relationship between characters at all, it's written as something else entirely. But that's a slightly different problem, and we'll come back to that in a moment. One of the patterns I mentioned earlier deserves its own discussion because it might be one of the most recognizable and honestly one of the most frustrating romance tropes in modern anime and manga: the brick wall protagonist. You've probably seen this character before. It's the kind of protagonist who somehow remains completely oblivious to even the most obvious romantic signals. A character can confess their feelings, they can flirt openly, they can practically throw themselves at the protagonist, and somehow the protagonist still doesn't understand what's happening. They misunderstand it, they ignore it, or they act like they've never encountered the concept of romantic attraction before. And the strange thing is that this trope has been around for so long that people almost expect it at this point. But if you stop and think about it for a moment, the whole premise starts to feel absurd. Even when I was a kid watching these kind of stories, I remember thinking, how can someone actually be this stupid? At some point it stops feeling like a believable character trait and starts feeling like something else entirely. The protagonist isn't dense because that's who they are. They're dense because the story can't allow the romance to progress yet. And this becomes especially obvious in the so-called harem series, although in many cases calling those stories harems is actually misleading. Just because multiple characters are attracted to the protagonist doesn't automatically make it a harem story. If the protagonist never actually forms relationships with those characters, and the narrative never commits to that structure, then what you really have isn't a harem. It's just a group of characters orbiting a protagonist who refuses to acknowledge what's happening. A series like Toraboro is probably one of the clearest examples, and don't get me wrong, years ago when I watched this anime, I loved it. The protagonist is surrounded by a huge number of potential love interests. Many of them make their feelings extremely obvious, and yet for most of the story the protagonist remains completely oblivious. The only time the situation changes at all is when some of the characters eventually become so direct that they basically have to say it outright: yes, I'm in love with you. And that's the point. The story isn't really developing romance. It's simply forcing the protagonist to acknowledge something the audience understood hundreds of chapters ago. That's why this trope can become so frustrating. Because instead of allowing relationships to grow naturally, the narrative keeps resetting the situation. The characters don't move forward, the emotions don't evolve, and the romance gets stuck in a permanent state of almost happening. But not every story relies on oblivious characters to stall a romantic subplot. Sometimes the problem goes in the opposite direction. Instead of refusing to move the relationship forward, the story tries to create romantic tension by constantly repeating the same type of drama. If you look across a lot of anime, manga, light novels, and web novels, you start to notice that the range of romantic conflicts is surprisingly narrow. The same situations appear over and over again: love triangles, the sudden appearance of a rival love interest, a misunderstanding that could be resolved with a single conversation, or a group of potential romantic partners where it's painfully obvious who the real relationship will be from the beginning. In theory, these kinds of conflicts are supposed to create tension, but when they're used repeatedly, they often start to feel predictable. You already know how the situation will resolve. The rival character will never actually win. The misunderstanding will eventually disappear. It's just gonna be an extremely annoying process, and the extra love interest usually exists only to delay the inevitable outcome. At that point, the drama stops adding anything meaningful to the story. It becomes a way to stretch the romantic subplot without actually developing the relationship. And sometimes the strangest part is that this kind of drama isn't even necessary, because in many of these stories, romance isn't supposed to be the main focus in the first place. It's just a subplot inside a much larger narrative. When that's the case, forcing traditional romantic drama into the story can actually make the relationship feel less natural. Instead of growing out of the characters and their situation, the conflict starts to feel like something the story inserted simply because it thinks romance needs it. But romantic tension doesn't always need to come from jealousy or competition. It can come from much more interesting places: different values, different goals, personal struggles, or the way two characters influence each other as they grow. And when stories rely too heavily on the same recycled conflicts, they often miss the chance to explore those deeper dynamics. The relationship becomes less about the characters themselves and more about repeating a formula the audience has already seen countless times. Another very common problem appears when the romance technically exists in a story, but never actually becomes important. The characters acknowledge it, The story hints at it. Sometimes the audience can clearly see the romantic feelings there, but the relationship never develops into anything meaningful. It just sits in the background of the narrative. We see this in a lot of long-running web novels. The protagonist has a potential love interest, the characters show hints of romantic attraction, there might even be small moments that suggest the relationship could eventually become important, but the story never actually does anything with it. The plot moves forward, the protagonist continues their journey, and the romance remains stuck exactly where it started. Sometimes you can even reach the end of the story and realize something strange. Nothing ever happened with the romantic subplot. There were hints, there were moments, but there was never a real conclusion. I remember experiencing this very clearly with a Korean web novel called I Became an Academy Genius Shikigami Summoner. Throughout the story, there are multiple female characters around the protagonist. Some of them show hints of romantic interest. The story occasionally suggests that something might develop, but by the time the narrative ends, the romance never really goes anywhere. When I finished it, I remember having this strange reaction. Wait, what actually happened with the romance? And the answer was basically nothing. It was there for the entire story, but it never really mattered. There's another version of this problem that shows up frequently in cultivation novels. This is actually a genre I enjoy a lot, but romance is often one of its weakest elements. A good example of this is the web novel Cultivation Online. When I first started reading it, the premise felt interesting. It seemed like it might bring something new to the genre. But as the story progressed, it gradually became one of the most generic cultivation narratives I had seen. And the romance ended up following one of the worst patterns in the genre. The protagonist spends most of the story traveling alone on their cultivation journey. Years pass in the story's timeline, then occasionally the protagonist returns to their love interests, spends a short period of time with them, and then leaves again to continue their journey. And this cycle repeats again and again. The relationship doesn't really develop, it doesn't influence the plot, it doesn't meaningfully change the characters. And the love interests themselves, they're not even characters anymore. They only exist so we can say that the protagonist has romantic partners. The romance exists mostly as an occasional interruption in the protagonist's journey before the story returns to the main narrative. At that point, the relationship stops feeling like a relationship. It starts to feel like something the story included simply because the genre expects it. And that's the core issue with this kind of romance. It's technically present in the story, but it doesn't affect the narrative in any meaningful way. And when that happens, the audience is left wondering the same question again. If the relationship doesn't change the characters, the plot, or the emotional stakes of the story, then why was it there in the first place? Another pattern that shows up a lot in modern novels is something slightly different. This is what we call smut-driven romance. Now, to be clear, I'm not talking about stories that are openly written as adult romance. That's a completely different category. Those stories are built around the premise from the beginning, and the audience knows exactly what they're getting into. The problem appears when a story that could have been something else entirely starts following the same patterns you see in smut-driven narratives. And when that happens, one of the first things that usually changes is the protagonist. If you've read enough of these stories, you probably know exactly the type of character I'm talking about. There's this strangely recurring protagonist that shows up again and again in these stories. They tend to have the same personality traits. They're usually loud, obnoxious, and constantly swearing. Every sentence feels like it needs to contain some kind of crude remark or sexual comment. And almost every time they encounter a female character, the first thing the story focuses on is how attractive that character is and how much the protagonist immediately wants to sleep with them. After seeing this pattern enough times, it starts to feel less like a character and more like a template. And sometimes this can completely derail what might have been an interesting premise. I remember trying to read one web novel that actually started with a pretty creative idea. The protagonist wakes up reincarnated into the body of an alien creature on an unknown planet. That's a genuinely interesting setup. You could do a lot with that kind of concept, exploring survival, adapting to a new body, learning about an alien ecosystem, or discovering a completely unfamiliar world. But not even 3 chapters into the story, things went in a completely different direction. If I remember correctly, it's only been maybe 10 or 20 minutes since the protagonist wakes up in this new body and starts trying to understand their situation, and suddenly a space pirate character appears on the planet. The protagonist sees them, and immediately the narrative turns into a long internal rant about how attractive this character is and how much the protagonist wants to get them into bed. And at that point I remember thinking, you just woke up as an alien creature on an unknown planet. You barely understand your own body. You don't know where you are. And this is what the story wants to focus on right now? That moment perfectly captures the core problem with a lot of these smut-driven stories. They're not really written as stories, they're written as smut. The narrative exists, but it's secondary. The plot, the characters, and the world building are all structured around creating situations where the smut can happen, and because of that the characters often stop behaving like believable people. Their personalities become exaggerated, their reactions become unnatural, and the romantic dynamic starts feeling more like a checklist of fantasy scenarios than an actual relationship between characters. But the interesting thing is that smut itself isn't necessarily the problem. There are stories that include it without letting it dominate the entire narrative. A good example of this is a web novel called I Became a 6-Star Gacha Character. This is actually a really fun story, and I would genuinely recommend it to people who are interested in the genre. What's interesting about it is that even though the story does include some explicit scenes, it's not really structured as a smut novel. In more than 500 chapters, there are maybe around 10 chapters that actually focus on that kind of content. The vast majority of the story is focused on the characters, the world, and the main narrative, and because of that, the relationships don't feel forced. The world itself is written as a place where people are more open about casual relationships, so when those situations happen, it doesn't feel unnatural. The protagonist's personality also supports that dynamic. They're portrayed as someone who is comfortable approaching relationships in that way, so the interactions feel consistent with the character. More importantly, those moments don't dictate the rest of the story. They don't define the characters, they don't drive the entire plot. They're just occasional elements within a much larger narrative. And that's really the key difference. Smut itself isn't inherently bad, but when it becomes the main engine driving the story, everything else starts to suffer. The characters become flatter, the relationships become artificial, and the narrative stops feeling like a story and starts feeling like a sequence of fantasies loosely connected by a plot. Now we arrive at a type of romance that works very differently from everything we've talked so far. Because when it comes to gacha games, romance often isn't written the way it is in anime, manga, or web novels. And in many cases, it's not really written as a relationship between characters at all. Now to be clear, I'm not talking about romances between characters inside the story itself. Those can work perfectly fine. And I'm also not talking about games that intentionally commit to full character relationships. For example, something like Snowbreak eventually leaned very heavily into a direct romance with the protagonist. That's a deliberate choice, and the story is structured around it. What I'm talking about is something much more common across gacha games. The kind of romance that isn't really meant to exist within the narrative itself. Instead, it exists for a completely different purpose. Player projection. In a lot of gacha games, characters are written in a way that subtly suggests romantic interest towards the player, not necessarily towards another character in the story. And to make that work, the game usually introduces a very specific kind of protagonist, the self-insert protagonist. If you've played enough gacha games, you probably know exactly the kind of character I'm talking about. They often have very little personality, very limited dialogue, very vague motivations. Sometimes they barely even exist as a character at all, and that's not an accident. That kind of protagonist is designed to be empty on purpose so the player can project themselves into the role. Instead of watching a relationship develop between two characters, the player is supposed to imagine themselves as the protagonist and mentally place themselves inside the story. From a marketing perspective, this makes a lot of sense. Gacha games rely heavily on character attachment. If players feel personally connected to a character, they're more likely to keep playing, and more importantly, they're more likely to spend money on that character. But from a storytelling perspective, this approach creates a lot of problems, because the moment the protagonist becomes a self-insert, the narrative loses something very important. It loses an actual character at the center of the story. A well-written narrative usually relies on interactions between characters, their personalities clash, their goals conflict, their relationships evolve. But when the protagonist exists primarily as a projection of the player, those dynamics become extremely difficult to write. But when the protagonist exists primarily as a projection of the player, those dynamics become extremely difficult to write. The protagonist can have a strong personality, they can behave in ways that contradict the player expectations, and they often can't form meaningful romantic relationships within the story. Because if the narrative commits to one relationship, it breaks the illusion for players who prefer another character. But the real problem goes even deeper than that, because this design doesn't just create empty protagonists, it also affects stories where the protagonist could have been a fully developed character. There are plenty of gacha narratives where the protagonist actually has a backstory, a personality, and a defined role in the world. On paper, they should function just like any other protagonist in a traditional story. But because the game still wants to preserve that player projection element, those characters aren't allowed to fully exist as themselves. Their personalities get softened, their dialogue becomes neutral, their romantic relationships remain vague. Even when the story clearly builds emotional connections between characters, the narrative often refuses to fully commit. Because the moment the protagonist becomes too defined, the moment the story treats them like a real person with real relationships, the self-insert illusion starts to break. And when that happens, the entire player projection structure stops working. So the story ends up stuck in a strange middle ground. The protagonist is technically a character, but they're also not allowed to fully behave like one. Characters constantly show hints of affection towards them, there are emotional moments, there are scenes that clearly push towards romance, but the relationships almost never reach a clear conclusion, because they can't. The narrative needs to keep the romantic space open for the player, and this is exactly the environment that created one of the most controversial elements of modern gacha storytelling, the self-insert protagonist. A character who technically exists in the story, but often feels constrained by the role they're forced to play. And unfortunately, once this kind of character becomes the center of the narrative, it can affect everything around them. The relationships become vague, the romantic dynamics become artificial, and the story starts bending itself around the idea of maintaining that projection fantasy. Which is why, for me personally, this might actually be the most frustrating type of romance we've talked about so far. Because unlike the other problems, like oblivious protagonists or recycled romantic drama, this one isn't just a writing trope, it's a structural design choice. And once a story commits to that structure, even a well-written narrative can end up struggling against the limitations of the system itself. After talking about all of these different problems, it might start to sound like romance itself is the issue, but that's not really the case. Romance can be a fantastic element in a story. It can deepen characters, raise emotional stakes, and make the world feel more personal. Sometimes it can even become one of the most memorable parts of a narrative. The real problem isn't romance, the problem is how casually it's often included. A lot of stories seems to treat romance like something that just needs to be there. Not because the story truly benefits from it, but because the genre expects it. Readers expect it, writers are used to seeing it, so it gets included almost automatically, and when that happens, the romance often ends up falling into the exact patterns we talked about earlier. The oblivious protagonist who prevents the relationship from progressing, the endless recycling of romantic drama, the relationship that technically exists but never really matters, the smut-driven dynamics that override the actual story, or the gacha-style self-insert structure that prevents relationships from fully forming in the first place. But none of these things are inevitable, they're just habits the genre has developed over time, because when romance actually works in a story, it usually follows a very simple principle. The story commits to it. If a writer decides that romance is going to be part of the narrative, then that relationship needs to actually matter. It should influence the characters, it should affect their decisions, it should change something about the story. That doesn't mean it has to become the main focus. A romantic subplot doesn't need to be dramatic or complex. It doesn't need constant love triangles or emotional breakdowns. Sometimes the best romantic dynamics are the simplest ones. They can be funny, they can be awkward, they can be quiet moments between characters that simply make the story feel more human. But even when romance is just a small subplot, it still needs to exist for a reason. It should add something to the story. Maybe it reveals something about the characters, maybe it changes how they approach the world, maybe it creates moments that the audience genuinely cares about. But if the romance doesn't affect anything, if it doesn't change the characters, the story, or the emotional stakes, then it starts to feel like something that was added simply because the genre expected. And that's really the pattern we've been seeing across a lot of modern serialized storytelling. Romance isn't always included because the story needs it. Sometimes it's included because the writers assume it should be there, especially in genres where many authors grew up reading stories that already followed those patterns. So when they write their own stories, they naturally fall back on the same ideas, the same tropes, the same dynamics, the same romantic formulas the audiences have seen hundreds of times before. And over time, those patterns just keep repeating themselves. But the truth is, romance doesn't need to follow any of those formulas. If a story doesn't need romance, it's perfectly fine to leave it out entirely, and if the story does include romance, then it deserves the same care as every other part of the narrative. Because when it's written well, romance isn't just an extra element. It can become one of the things that makes a story truly memorable, and maybe that's the most important thing to remember. If you enjoyed this video, consider leaving a like, subscribing to the channel and letting me know your thoughts in the comments. I'm also curious to hear your examples, stories where you think romance was handled really well, or stories where it completely fell apart. As always, thanks for watching, and I'll see you in the next one.